Okay, so the first one I'm going to do is the Roller Gauze bandaging. So the first thing we're going to do is, let's say there's a cut on his forearm, is I'm going to grab the gauze and put it onto the cut and apply a lot of pressure. And then once I get the bleeding under control, whether I need to put more gauze on or it's good as is, I grab the roller bandage, get it at a 45-degree angle, wrap around one time, and then once I get it around one time, I want to fold this part over, creating a dog ear, and then keep on bandaging it up. And then, once I get it to this point, I don't have actual roller gauze. But what I would want to do is I would want to extend out the remaining end once I get it to a suitable point. And I would want to use my index finger of my other hand to tear it in half, like that, to be able to tie a knot to keep the dressing nice in place. Is what I would do if I had the right equipment. And then that's it for that skill. Okay, we got one down. Okay, so the skill I'm going to be doing now is for the Ace bandage. Is first, I'm going to want to get the gauze, and let's say the cut's right here. I'm going to want to apply direct pressure onto it to help control the bleeding. Then once the bleeding's either under control, I put more gauze on to control the bleeding. I want to grab the bandage and start at the furthest point away from the heart for this cut, which would be at the end of the wrist right here. And then I would want to start rolling and continue rolling one time over, and then fold that beginning part back to create a dog ear, and keep on rolling and wrap the bandage overlapping it as it's going. And I would go until the end of the until the tape at the end of the bandage is in place. Let's just say at the end of this bandage there's tape, and then it would be in place after that, and then that's the Ace bandage skill. I'm definitely gonna have to fucking edit all these. Okay, so the next skill we're gonna be doing is bandaging the eye with an injury from an impaled object. So the first thing I don't want to do is remove the impaled object, because that can just cause more bleeding and more complications. First thing I'd want to do is put more gauze around the impaled object. I don't have that much gauze to be able to do it, but I would want to circle it around it. Then after that, I would want to grab 2 pieces of bulky bandages like gauze and put it on both sides of the injury, keeping the object in place. And then after doing that, I would want to put a shield over it. In this case, we're going to use a cup to be able to cover it, and you don't want to use a styrofoam cup to do this. And you also want to make sure the cup is not touching the impaled object when you do this. And then once you get the cup in place, we're going to use a roller bandage to be able to set the shield in place. And then this end would have an adhesive end, which would keep it in place, and then that's the skill. Okay, so for this video, we're going to be doing the rigid split method. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is check for circulation beyond the point of injury. For this case, we're going to say that he has a lower leg fracture in his tibia. The first thing I'm going to do is check for circulation. And then next thing I'm going to do is going to want to check for motor function. So go ahead and try and bend your toes for me. Looks good. And now we're going to want to move on to applying the splint. So I'm going to want to support it on both sides. What I would want to do is support the fracture above and below the joint, or of the above joint and below joint. I would want to keep it in place. But we don't have enough material to keep his ankle in place, so I'm going to go ahead and place the cardboard here. That's just what we're using for this. And then I'm going to want to get the bandages. I'm going to want them to go under here, so that way the patient's leg can stay immobilized and I can not have to move his leg up to get the bandage on. And when tying it, you don't want to tie it over his leg, you want to tie it off to the side onto your splint material. And then I would want to recheck for circulation once I got everything tied in place. Check motor function again. And that's the end of this part. Okay, so for this video, we're going to be doing the sling and binder method. So unfortunately, I don't have the correct bandage to be able to do the sling properly. So for this, I'm just going to use a sling that we had laying around to be able to demonstrate most of it as best as I can. The first thing I'm going to want to do is to say he has a fracture in his ulna and radius. So first thing I'm going to want to do is check for circulation beyond the point of injury. Check for motor function. Can you squeeze my hand? Check for sensation. Can you feel me touching your hand? Perfect. Now I'm going to want to apply the sling to the patient. Alright, you can go ahead and move your arm for me, please. Alright, now that I have the sling in place, I'm going to want to do the binder part of it, which is securing the arm to the body by wrapping a piece of bandage around it to keep it in place. Here, if you can just put your arm up for me, thank you. Alright, then after I do that, I'm just going to want to recheck for circulation, sensation, and motor control. Can you still squeeze my hand? Still feel my hand? Mm-hmm. And that's the end of this section. Alright, so for this video, I'm going to be doing the anatomical splint method. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is check for circulation beyond the point of injury. What leg is injured first? This one, so I'm going to want to check for circulation. Motor function, go ahead and move your toes if you can, and then can you feel me touching you? Perfect. Next, I'm going to want to position my bandages to be able to tie the legs together. Alright, now I'm going to want to tie the bandages. Have them off to the side. And you do not want to go directly over the knee. And you definitely do not want to go over the break too. And then after I get the bandages tied, I'm going to want to place padding between any body parts to fill the void. Unfortunately, we don't have enough bandages to be able to demonstrate it properly, so we're just using pieces of cardboard to act as bandages to fill the void. And then after that, I'm going to want to recheck for circulation and sensation beyond the point of injury. Can you feel that? And then are you able to wiggle your toe? Perfect. And then that's the end of this part. Okay, so for this part, we're going to be doing the soft splint method. The first thing I'm going to want to do is check for circulation beyond the point of injury. Go ahead and wiggle your toe for me if you can. And can you feel Feel me touching your foot. Perfect. Now we want to get the triangle bandages and get them into place first by going under the heel of the foot. Then I'm going to want to get a blanket and gently wrap it around the injury. And then I'm going to want to tie my bandages into place once I get the blanket set. And then once I get the bandages set and everything in place, I'm going to want to check for circulation again beyond the point of injury, sensation, can you feel that? And then wiggle your toe for me if you can. And that is the soft splint method. Okay, so for this video, or this part, we're going to be doing the cervical motion manual restriction stabilization part. So the first thing I want to do is minimize any movement by placing my hands on both sides of my partner's head. So I'm going to want to get it to the point where he can't move his head back much at all, his head forward much at all, and very little lateral movement. And then also while this, I would usually have a partner with me checking his CSMN at the same time too. And I'm basically supporting the head in this position found right now so that his spinal cord has very minimal movement. And then after this, I'm going to make sure I'm also maintaining an open airway the entire way so that the patient can breathe. And then after this, I would want to have my partner, unfortunately we don't have a cervical collar to be able to use during this video, but what I would want to do is have my me maintaining the spinal motion manual restriction, and then my partner would be applying the appropriate size collar, C collar, around the patient's neck to be able to immobilize his neck to avoid any further injuries. And that's the end of this part. Okay, so for this part, what we would want to be doing is spine boarding, but unfortunately there is no proper way for me to get someone on a spine board with just one person. We need at least 4 people minimum to be able to do it properly and correctly. So I just want to go ahead and explain the steps of what we would be doing to do it, because I just don't want to do it by myself very improperly, because there's no good way to do it with just one person keeping everything immobilized and keeping everything in check. So the first thing we would want to do is one responder would want to maintain spinal motion restriction of the head, keeping C-spine, with an additional responder supporting the patient's shoulders, hips, and legs. We would want to roll the patient in unison, keeping the patient's head and spine in alignment until the patient is resting on their side, keeping C-spine the whole time as well. We would want to position the backboard next to the patient to be able to get him ready to be rolled onto the backboard. And then we would roll the patient onto the backboard in unison, all together, to make sure that nothing is moving around in his spine. And then after that, we would want to secure the patient's body. We would want to secure the patient's chest, secure the patient's arms, hips, thighs, and legs with the remaining straps, which is also called a spider strap, which we would be putting over the patient to keep him strapped to the board. And then we would want to, if necessary, secure the patient's hands in front of his body. After that, we would want to secure the patient's head. The whole time we're doing that, we're still keeping C-spine. One of us would be keeping C-spine. We would want to place padding beneath the head of the patient if it's not resting in line with the body. If a commercial head immobilizer is not available, we would place a folded or rolled blanket around the head and neck. And then after that, we would want to secure the forehead down onto the backboard. And that's how we would want to do a spinal board, but unfortunately, like I said before, I don't have the proper amount of people to be able to do it properly and correctly. So for this part, we're going to be doing the closed drag. You would want to do this if you suspect a patient of having any head or neck or spinal injury after a crash, let's say. The first thing we would want to do is position the patient on his back. And then I would want to grab his clothes right by his shoulder blade and have his head resting on my forearms to be able to immobilize his neck as much as possible when moving him to the safe place that we need him to be. So I want to kneel behind the patient, get my arms under his back, and grab his clothes by his shoulder blades, and then rest his arms on my forearm, his head onto my forearms, and then drag him back until I get him to where I need him to be. I would want to move carefully since you will be, I was moving backwards, and I would want to keep his back straight as possible while I'm moving him to where I need to be, and that's the close drag method. Okay, so for this part, we're going to do the blanket drag. So I'm going to want to position the blanket next to the patient, which I have already done. I'm going to want to gather the patient between me. I'm going to want to be between the patient and the blanket. I'm going to want to gather half the blanket and place it against the patient's side. Make sure it's 2 feet of it is extending past the patient's head. Next thing I want to do is gently roll the patient onto its side. I'm going to want to roll him towards my knees, reach across and grab the blanket and put it directly under or next to the patient. Then I'm going to want to gently roll the patient back onto the blanket and be really careful not to twist his spinal column at all. Then I'm going to want to wrap the blanket around the patient as much as I can. Now I'm going to want to gather up the excess at the patient's head, and then from here I can drag him to wherever I need to be and trying my best to keep his spinal column as straight as possible. And that's the blanket drag. Okay, so for this part we're going to be doing the shoulder drag. It is not safe to do on a patient which is suspected of having a neck or spinal or head injury. The first thing I want to do is get behind the patient and go under his shoulders, his shoulder blades, or behind the shoulder blades, and hook up under his shoulders to be able to drag him. And I'm going to want to use my legs so that way I don't get my back involved and injure it during this process. And then from here I'm just going to want to slightly lift the patient up and drag him. And that is the shoulder drag method. Okay, so the next thing I would be doing is the extremity lift, but to be able to do this properly, I would need myself and at least one other responder to be able to do it. So I just want to explain how the method is done, so that way I can at least have it on video, me knowing how it's done and explaining how it's done. So how you would do it is one responder would kneel behind the patient, keeping the back straight, reaching under the patient's arm and grasping the patient's opposite wrist. The second responder would want to kneel down between the patient's legs and firmly grasp around the patient's knees and thighs. On a signal from the responder at the patient's head, both responders would move from a crouching position to a standing position. And that is how you would perform the extremity lift, but unfortunately, like I said before, I don't have another person here to be able to do it properly on a video. So the next thing we would want to be doing is the 2-person seat carry, and unfortunately I can't show it properly because I only have one other person with me, so I thought it'd be best to explain it than not to include it at all during this lab video that I'm filming. So what you would want to do is put one arm under the patient's thigh and the other across the patient's back. Interlock your arms with those of a second responder under the patient's leg and across the patient's back. You want to make sure the patient places their arms over the responder's shoulder. Lift the patient in the seat formed by the responder's arms. And then you would want to keep your back straight and lift with your legs, and that is how you would perform the 2-person seat carry. Okay, so the next part we're going to be doing is the ankle drag. This is not safe to do on a patient who is suspected of a head, neck, or spinal injury. So what I would want to do is firmly grasp the patient's ankles and basically move backwards, carefully moving backwards as I'm doing it. Be careful to form the long axis of the body and not bump into the patient's head, and keep my back as straight as possible, or keep his back as straight as possible, and do not twist to keep everything set in place. So I want to firmly grasp him by the ankles, and mainly use my legs to drive him backwards, and not want to use any of my upper body too much, because I could also injure myself doing this. And that is the ankle drag. Okay, so the next one I'm going to be filming is the firefighter drag. So I'm going to want to position the patient on his back and bind his hands together gently at the wrists. After doing that, I'm going to want to straddle the partner on my hands and knees and slip my head through the patient's arms, place the patient's bound wrist behind my head. I'm going to want to slowly crawl forward, carrying the patient with me. And that is the firefighter drag. All right, so the next one I'm going to be demonstrating is the fireman carry. So first I'm going to want to grasp the patient's wrist and put it over and around my arm. Then I'm going to want to, while standing on the patient's toes, pull the patient over my shoulder and pass an arm between the legs and grasp the arm nearest to me. And that is the fireman carry. Okay, so for this part, we're going to do the pack strap carry. So I'm going to want to position myself in front of the person I want to carry. I'm going to have the patient stand or have a second responder support the patient. Position myself with my back to the patient. I'm going to want to cross the patient's arms in front of me and grasp the patient's wrists. Lean slightly forward and pull the patient onto my back and walk safely to where I need him to be. And that is the pack strap carry. Okay, so for this video, we're going to be doing the walking assist. So I'm going to place the patient's arm across my shoulder and hold onto it with one hand. Support the patient with my other hand around the patient's waist, and then this will help him walk when he's not able to walk properly. And that is the walking assist. Okay, so for this one, we're going to be doing the direct ground lift. Unfortunately, we need at least 3 responders to be able to do this, and I don't have the required amount of people to be able to do it properly, so I just wanted to go ahead and explain it real fast. So first, all responders line up on one side and kneel close to the patient. The patient should cross arms over their chest. And next, what we're going to want to do is the responder kneeling at the patient's head places one arm under the patient's shoulder, cradling their head, and places the other arm under the patient's upper back. The next responder places one arm under the patient's waist and the other under the buttocks. The third responder cradles the patient's hips and legs. On a signal from the responder at the patient's head, all 3 responders lift the patient to their knees. Provide support by rolling the patient against the responder's chest. On the next signal, all carefully raise to a standing position and then move the patient. Keep back straight and lift with the legs. And that is the end of Lab 3. Thank you for letting me be able to turn this in late to be able to get some kind of credit for it. I really do appreciate it.